In order to best his foes, Ratchet used the warrior's time-honored tradition of jumping.
Hi everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and this is a 4K Let's Play for Insomniac's Ratchet and Clank, and this is running on PlayStation 4 Pro in its 4K mode. And joining me to discuss the game, David Bearton.
Hey Rich, how's it going?
Fantastic, thank you. And, well, this has been a bit of a treat, hasn't it, Dave?
Oh, it has indeed, yeah. I remember when I first played this on the standard PlayStation 4, I came away really impressed with the visual quality in general, and just, how close it looked to kind of like a Pixar movie in terms of how the game was being rendered.
Yeah, it's really impressive stuff on base PlayStation 4. They've since added some additional tweaks to that game since we initially covered it. But the big news, I think, here is the fact that the Pro version just looks so good. It seems to be retaining the 30 frames per second lock. We'll have to investigate that in a bit more depth. But I think the big takeaway here is simply, well, the resolution boost is just really pronounced and just looks fantastic.
Yeah, it's very, very impressive. When I first saw this, I was, kind of convinced that it was running at, native 4K resolution just by the fact that I wasn't seeing any sort of visible scaling artifacts, and it has a really kind of crisp image while maintaining a sort of smooth, sort of jaggy-free presentation.
Yeah, it's really interesting that we were kind of taking a look out on kind of tiny sub-pixel detail, which tends to show up upscaling artifacts or sort of imperfections in the upscaling process, but it was really solid, wasn't it?
Indeed, looking up close, when I was eyeballing the TV screen, you can tell there's a bit of softness, but yeah, every one of those individual sort of little fine details are sort of perfectly resolved, which I wasn't quite expecting.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's using temporal anti-aliasing now. It seems to be like a common theme on Pro titles, but in terms of the actual upscaling algorithms being used, well, Mark Cerny told me that Spider-Man, which is also being developed by the same developer, is using a technique where basically previous frames are jittered to kind of make the new frame, as it were. It's a technique we've seen before for several temporal anti-aliasing techniques, but it's never really looked this good, this clean before, and the screenshots we've seen of Spider-Man also look really impressive. So it's interesting to see here. I think they call it temporal injection. I think I read the blog post from Insomniac about what they're actually doing on the Pro. And, in terms of the sort of core visual set, it is essentially the base PlayStation 4 version scaled up to what looks like a kind of slightly soft 4K presentation, but I think the point is that when you look at a Pixar movie, it's pretty soft.
That's right, yeah, and with Ratchet and Clank we see a very sort of similar thing in terms of when you see a Pixar movie you don't see lots of jaggies on screen, and this game really sort of nails that look in terms of creating a smooth presentation, but I wouldn't say it looks, overly soft. It still has a lot of crispness there as well, which kind of almost gives you that illusion that you're looking at 4K, even though cleverly the game's actually not rendering natively.
We're going to have to take a look at some individual still screens to see if we can discern a native resolution as stuff, but in terms of the overall presentation it just looks really good. And going back to what you were saying about Pixar, I did read a post from a Pixar engineer who was basically saying that their approach for movies is tons of MSAA and yes, a bit of blur on there. And I think it's the case that while we're kind of used to a certain style of presentation in a video game, it's not really what plays in the movies. So it's interesting to see what Pixar are doing there, and also what Insomniac are doing, obviously, because there was indeed a Ratchet and Clank movie as well, wasn't there?
There was, yeah. It's surprising how close the actual game holds up to the movie. They share a very similar sort of aesthetic, especially with regards to like the assets and the way the effects are rendered, which is pretty impressive for a console title, I think. So one of the other really impressive things I noticed about Ratchet and Clank was the deployment of HDR. I remember when I first sat down to play this, I thought, it looks kind of like as I remembered it to be when I tried it out first time round on the base PS4, but after turning HDR off and then turning it on again, the difference is really dramatic.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, Dave, because John, who was viewing this on an LG OLED 4K display, wasn't hugely taken aback by how good the HDR was, but in the Office sort of mid-range Panasonic screen, it's a night and day difference with the HDR, and you're right, the presentation with HDR on this particular screen it just looks correct, doesn't it? That's the bottom line. It looks correct, and then you turn off HDR and suddenly the colour balance just looks completely wrong. So it's not exactly the most dramatic HDR presentation in terms of the wow factor, but in terms of correctness, in terms of how good it looks generally, when you actually have them side by side, it is a huge difference, and it's kind of a shame that we can't show that yet in our videos. Obviously we're going to be working on adding HDR as soon as we can. There's actually a technological limit there in terms of what we're actually capable of capturing at the moment, so we're waiting for the sort of ingest technology just to sort of catch up there. But yeah, this looks stunning on HDR, and up until now there's been a really strong argument that you should maybe just concentrate on a really good 4K screen and maybe upgrade to HDR further on down the line, but we're actually getting a really palpable upgrade on a mid-range screen here.
Exactly, and I think one of the interesting things with HDR and Ratchet and Clank in general is immediately when you think about HDR you think, oh, you're going to get these extra details in the highlights or sort of extra detail in dark levels, but what Ratchet and Clank does is kind of apply it differently. So rather than getting lots of extra detail, we're just getting much more contrast, so the depth between sort of light and dark imagery is a lot more pronounced, and I don't know, it just seems like everything from the way the colours are displayed to the specular highlights just has more punch rather than more detail. So even if you're not initially getting that sort of extra detail you expect from HDR, I definitely think that in this game anyway, you get an image that is a lot more natural and as you'd expect it to look, I guess.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, we're moving on now further into the game, and this is kind of like where it all started to click for me. I hadn't played the title before. I just sat down Sunday evening, right, going to play Ratchet and Clank. I'm hearing a lot of good things about it. And the amount of action that's kicking off on screen, the amount of objects flying about, the physics, all of the action that we're seeing, it just sort of runs without a beat. And obviously we've had an issue recently with a minority of Pro titles that aren't running as good as they should do. In fact, the base hardware is running smoother, which, you know, I just can't believe. But it is really great to see a title that's really pushing things in all directions. And thus far it's holding up. I'm not seeing any kind of major downgrade compared to what we've seen on some other titles. I think Deus Ex is probably the biggest sort of disappointment so far. But this is just absolutely solid. And, well, what can I say? It looks great, plays great.
Yeah, I agree. It looks exceptional, you know, and then the fact that they've got all these little particles and nuts and bolts blasting around on screen while sort of maintaining what looks like a relatively solid, you know, 30 FPS is great stuff, especially with the resolution boost. In fact, it's probably one of the things that impressed me most when I first played the game is that they've really kind of optimized it around hitting 30 FPS without necessarily, you know, sacrificing graphical quality to do so. It's got a nice balance between the amount of effects on screen and frame rate, I think.
Yeah, because historically, of course, Ratchet and Clank was a title that ran, I was going to say target 60 frames per second, but it's more that runs with an unlocked frame rate, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember it used to run more closely at 60 FPS on PS2, but certainly in the PS3 days it was kind of like anything above 30 was gravy, I guess, you know. It wasn't that stable. Yeah,
but with this title, and I think with the later PS3 titles, they moved to 30 Hz, and now we're locked there, even frame pacing, all good stuff. So now we're moving on into one of the flying sections, which I'm playing really, really badly. And I think the bottom line here is, again, you know, the presentation is just so visually rich, and it just looks spectacular. Tons of detail in there, and you really get a big payoff here at 4K. It just looks spectacular. In terms of the 1080p experience, I couldn't find any options for enhanced performance or anything like that, so I think we're looking at super sampling there. So bearing in mind we're already using TAA on the base hardware, I'm not entirely sure we'll see a huge upgrade there. I think the Pro's credentials here are going to be the 4K-ness of it and the HDR, which really was very, very impressive.
So yeah, it's definitely impressive stuff overall, and I can definitely see, you know, the 4K and HDR being the main selling point with this particular title.
I was completely blown away by it. First of all, I think that if you're a PS4 owner, you should seriously consider owning this game anyway. I reckon it's going to be awesome for base PS4 owners too. In terms of the Pro, this is one of the most impressive 4K presentations I've seen. Whether it is actually native 4K, doesn't really seem to matter in this case because, you know, we're getting a huge amount of detail here. The HDR is absolutely superb, and generally I had a superb time playing it, so highly recommended both for base PS4 owners and Pro. Okay, so I think we're going to leave the commentary there for now. We'll let the gameplay footage play out, and you can experience more of the game's visual treats, of which there are many. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do like, subscribe, and remember that if you want to see this video the way it was meant to be seen, digitalfoundry.net, we've got a download there for Patreon supporters. But that's all I've got for you for now. Thanks for watching.
Have a wrong that needs to be righted, an injustice that needs to be remedied. All the galactic ranges. No problem is too big. No problem is too small. Well, some problem is too small. We have...
Hey, Ratchet! Are you at Al's place yet?
Almost there.
Who's out there? Don't make me call the authorities. 7 levels into Unicop 2, return of Unicop. And so help me, if I have to put down this controller...
That must be Big Al's place.